Welcome in this new podcast episode. And today I'm talking with a special guest. She's returning to the show. Welcome, Nathalie Nahai.
Thank you. Nice to be in conversation with you again.
Yeah. And I have to just mention to make sure that people understand. So the previous one was October 31st, 2019. So that's 4 years ago almost. And the one before that was in March 2017. We broke it up in two episodes. It's wonderful. There you learn about the history and everything you've done. So we're not going to redo that. We're going to talk about the things that we learned in the podcast from the experts. We're going to talk about ideas that we got from this and the changes that happened because of this in our lives and our thinking and the way that we have our business and so on. So let me kick this off with, I have two things that I really want to know and I don't want to forget. So first of all, on your LinkedIn bio, in the banner, it says, exploring what it means to be human in the age of AI.
Mm-hmm.
And you have had a number of conversations in your podcast, the Hive podcast, that is about AI. I will have in the show notes the link to the podcast, of course, and you can look at the episodes yourselves. But what have you found out about being human in this age?
So one of the key things that I think has really become more and more apparent to me, and it was kind of nailed clearly in the UNESCO. So UNESCO had a conference last week on frameworks for ethics in neurotechnology. And I was watching a stream session. It was an all-female panel, which I didn't realize till halfway through. And I was like, oh, hang on, it's all women. And the man was a moderator, which is an interesting inversion to what one often sees. And one of the things that really shone through to me, and it relates to AI as well, was that all of these questions around technology and especially around AI are often framed from the perspective of the technology itself. And what I really got from this panel and from the other interviews that I've had with various people on the show is that actually it's not about the technology itself. That's it's the lens through which we're looking at it. And actually the problem that we're trying to solve is a social and cultural one, which is what is it that we care about as societies with different values, different cosmovisions, different backgrounds, different resources. What is it that we care about as societies? What values do we want to kind of enshrine and preserve? And then how do we bring that rooting or desire to the questions around how technology is going to shape our civilization? And so it's kind of, rather than a technological question, the framework is much more effective and interesting if it's a social, cultural one. And from that perspective, rather than legislating for things like specific technologies, you would legislate for the impact of those technologies and potential harms. So for instance, to give a very rudimentary example, that I find quite useful, you don't say you can't have a hammer because you could smash someone's head in. You say, right, the hammer itself is permissible. Anyone can own and have a hammer, but the use of that hammer to build a house will be okay. And yet the use of that hammer to cause bodily harm to another person is not okay. So you're thinking about social cultural impact and you're legislating for harms that then will dictate ways in which technologies can be developed and applied. So those are the key things that I think in the conversation around AI are particularly present in my mind. Possibly also the third thing which fits within that is the understanding of and relationship to synthetic relationships and persuasion and nudging and faking that is only just starting to kick in. So we also need to think about how do we make sure that companies are legally required to, and this is a big question, to essentially tell people when the entity they're speaking with is a bot versus a real person. Are there specific guardrails that need to be in place in terms of ways in which conversations might go? If you make it too human-like, people will ignore like people do with ChatGPT. It's like, yes, your private information is not private, and yet people will form bonds because human psychology is powerful and it's strong. And so we'll kind of ignore the conscious information and just go based on feeling and then give away lots of personal data. So we need to think also about how do you regulate synthetic relationships and legislate for guardrails that make it easier for people to stay safe and that protects vulnerable folks. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot in the mix. These are some of the things that are at the forefront of my mind at the moment. What are your thoughts?
I'm thinking about this conversation, this talk that and you have to think about couples therapy. I'm looking for a name.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna just cut it out. Therapy. So I have to remember. I don't remember her name.
Is it Esther Perel, maybe?
Yes. She had a talk on South by Southwest in February this year about a digitization of therapy. It's a really interesting talk, and how she sees it, because there was a bot built on her podcasts.
Wow.
So
that she built, or that someone else built?
No, that someone else built.
Oh, wow. I mean, that's an interesting experiment, isn't it?
Well, if you would agree that it's an experiment, or if somebody is going to take your content and just uses it, that's a different thing as well. And also, I'm thinking about the thing you just mentioned about the hammer. If you look from that perspective, how would you then describe this for a gun?
So that's a good question. So I think if you're talking about specific weapons, and this is an argument to be made with technologically enabled materials. So you can 3D print guns, you can just get a blueprint for it and do it if you have the materials and you have access to the blueprint. I think there is something different in the intention that is at the heart of something that you create. So if you're creating something that can be multi-purpose and isn't just designed to cause harm, whether it's in self-defense or not, that's quite a different category than creating something which is specifically a weapon. Yeah, I mean, you just have to look at the death numbers in the States to see that if you own guns, deaths go up. Like, it's incontrovertible evidence. So yeah, I think there's also that question of, there's sort of the explicit weaponry, but then there's also thinking politically, if we're thinking about things like propaganda or ways in which to corral entire populations into states of discord that then make it much more easier to foment suspicion and social unrest and things like this. I mean, these are also not physical weapons, but forms of creating huge amounts of suffering. So it's kind of like, yeah, I think these things are not the same, but they are connected, but it depends on the category.
Yeah, I had a couple of talks recently in the podcast. One was with a professor who is educated on technology and on psychology. So an interesting combination. And what he says is, if the situation that we are in today is not caused by the monetary system or the capitalism or anything, it's caused by technology. The way that technology works is it will just want to grow from itself. So, for example, he gives an example of a city. If you have a city like Amsterdam that wants to grow, because if you grow, you get more people and you get more young people, and then you have more companies who can use those young people. And so what it does, it will attract people from other cities who will stay smaller, right? So, or actually degrow. And so I cannot explain exactly the theory he mentioned, but the idea is that technology in itself is the cause of what we are in today. And I think that is an interesting theory that we're looking at. For example, if you think about the whole idea of AI and the companies that are working on it today, and the way that we should regulate this maybe, is that in general that we let companies develop these technologies without really thinking through the effects, right? So about for example, Facebook started as a nice network for people to connect, but at some point it influenced people's ideas. Actually, it influenced the election.
Yeah.
And that's harmful, right? So it started with a innocent thought, and it became a machine which was unstoppable.
Well, then let me just add something to that, because, and here's the thing, like, so there is something about, so the original Facebook was basically a hot or not profile or like platform to profile women to say, are you hot? I mean, it was,
Agree.
the guy's a twat. I'm
That's not,
sorry. It's
yeah,
just
you're
like,
correct. That's not
you know, if you
harmful.
go in with a sense of we're just gonna rate women, and I know that we judge one another. I'm not saying that that in itself is bad or right, but I mean,
You're right.
he is not someone that I would consider even remotely wise. And if you go in with like a 20-year-old brain thinking, oh yeah, I'm just gonna say what women I'd shag, and I mean, and then that scales, the seed of the idea is not inherently a good one. It doesn't bode well. um, and then there are examples of like platforms like, for instance, the beloved MySpace. And I'm old enough that when I was doing my music, I had a profile in there. That did generate a sense of community. There were platforms, and Twitter back in the day was a platform where, at least for a good few years, there was more generative conversation. I think now LinkedIn is somewhere where, because there is no anonymity, it's connected with your profile. You've got skin in the game because it could potentially mean your income. So suddenly there are higher stakes. So people behave. I mean, this is the whole thing around social shaming. There are certain norms that keep people in check. So if you have someone who believes themselves to be untouchable, who creates something that is widely adopted and popular, and then they're in it because of profit ideas or whatever, then you're going to end up with a shit show, frankly. So there's this, but that's not the only way it has to be. It's just the way that I think our current systems, it's a path that's very easy and very culturally sanctioned. It's like we all want to have a roof over our heads, and the only way to do that for most of us is to make money. And so it's the whole kind of like race to the bottom. How can I make the most and make sure mine and my kind of me and mine are safe, or and then it just goes to excess. No one needs billions.
Yeah, and the question that I think is an interesting one in this is, what is your enough?
Yeah. What's sufficiency?
Yeah. So I asked that in workshops and in presentation that I do. So what is your enough? So first, what's your personal enough? Then what's your business enough? So how many people is enough in your business? How many profits? How many revenue? Mm-hmm. Because if you know that answer, right, and you determine the answer now, whatever the moment is for you, however big your company is, but determine the answer now, and then comes the tricky part. Determine what you do when you get to that point.
Yeah.
So what will you do to make sure you don't go beyond that point? Because we always do, right? So if we make 100 grand, we say that was plenty. That's enough. We can live and have a lot of great things from it. But the moment we're there, we go like, oh, 120 is even better.
Yeah.
It's how it works. Mm. And if you really, really go into it and you look at how much is really enough, it's really low, that number. It's so depending on where you live, but in general, and on Earth, we could live around 50,000, or even somewhere in some countries like 17,000 euros or dollars. So that's a lot less than we think is enough to have a good life, and especially thinking about the difference between making enough and well-being.
Yeah.
What can we do to create well-being? So what have you learned from your conversations about well-being?
One of the things that's come up time and again, and thinking about this thing of enoughness and sufficiency. So someone I really like who talks about this quite a bit is Della Duncan. She runs the Upstream podcast. She's like a renegade economist. And she talks about right livelihood. And I think one of the things that's interesting there is that it's woven into exchange on a more relational level. And so as long as you have a comfortable, and again, this is dependent on what your subjective experience of comfortable is, how many dependents you have, what your sense of precarity is, all of these things. But if you have a sense of sufficiency in terms of being financially comfortable enough, then the question is, what are the things that create that sense of well-being and connection and belonging? And community is a huge one for me. And I think there's something around, and I've thought about this quite a bit, like coming from London, where I was born and then lived for many, many years, and the excitement and the cultural variety and diversity and richness of London, I always thought it was very nourishing and exciting. And, my 20s and early 30s, there's a sense of ambition and excitement. And then coming to Barcelona, which was kind of a an accident. I came for 3 months and ended up staying, and here we are 6.5 years later. One of the things that I didn't expect, and that has been a revelation, especially because I was very driven. I still am, but in slightly different ways, was this sense that actually the things that most give me joy and a sense of anchoring is being able to see the people that I love on a regular basis. And it's as simple as that. It's the sense of being able to have some kind of rhythm, especially because my work, possibly like yours, is quite unstructured. We have a lot of projects going on, lots of different kind of timetables. We don't have necessarily, unless we create it for ourselves, a rhythm that keeps us in check. And so there's something about punctuating the month or the weeks with some kind of rhythm or ritual. I think that's a really important element. Community, bringing that together. Also making time. Someone else was talking about this, and I still struggle with this quite a lot internally, but I'm aware of it, is this sense of restlessness and thinking that if I'm not being active doing something constructive, whether it's making money or not. I mean, the podcast is a personal project. I put money into it. I certainly don't make any from it. But whether it's something like that or the painting or actual paid work, this sense that if I'm resting, I'm kind of sitting on my laurel. I don't know, there's something that's not okay about it. And then thinking about, from guests that I've spoken to, the sense of actually deep rest is important. I interviewed this amazing woman, Octavia Rahim, and she was talking about her practice as a teacher of yoga, especially yoga nidra, like these more passive, not passive necessarily, restful, because they're quite active in certain ways, but this sense of restful, restorative, radical yoga. And it's radical because we're so subsumed into this systemic idea that we have to be productive. If you're not doing something, what's the point of you? And that takes a lot of daily being like, oh, it's okay if I want to sit and read for an hour. It's okay if I want to spend 3 hours or 4 hours painting. Is it okay? Is it okay? Shouldn't I be making more money? And it's like, what is enough? And it's this constant kind of almost like awkward. It's like I'm staggering down my inner street thinking, is this okay? The most of the time. And yet one of the things that brings me back to that still point, to that anchor point, is community and music and the arts and eating together. And then also nature, going out and having hikes, all of that stuff. How would you begin to answer that question?
Well, a couple of things. I have determined what my enough is pretty clearly. So I know what it is. And everything that I do is mostly working for building networks or building something, but not building it for money. So I'm coaching for money, and I know what my enough is. And I don't need a lot of clients to have my enough. We almost paid off our mortgage. And almost is really like 1% is still left, but
amazing.
Yeah, it's really close to nothing, and that gives already a lot of mental freedom, right? So you don't have to think about a mortgage anymore.
Yeah,
and we want to move to a smaller house because I think just because it's just the two of us in the house, and it's too big for us. But the house is great. We still love living here. But I think looking at the number of resources we're using, that could be less if we just live in a smaller house. It's not cheap today because smaller houses are actually very expensive because there's a lot of demand and not a lot of offering. So as long as it's too expensive, we will stay in the house that we are in. What I do in the morning, for example, I go like almost every morning, like 90% of the time, I go for a walk, like 45 minutes or so. And I have this particular walk which goes out over that way. And then I come to this, it's not a park, but it's like an area which is created, but it's far away from a lot of noise. So when I'm there, it's almost quiet. Sometimes I hear the noise of the roads. There's two sides far away, but if the wind is right, you hear the noises. There's a train running by, but it only runs like every 15 minutes. So when you're in between those times and the wind is right, it's really quiet. So this morning, for example, it was really quiet, and it's just an amazing moment when I'm walking right there. It's just 5 minutes, but it goes like, oh my gosh, the silence. It's unbelievable.
I miss silence.
Yes. And I
Yeah,
think it's
yeah,
really important.
yeah.
And also, like what you just mentioned, I have the same feelings. I see that, and it has a lot, I think, to do with the faith, right? So from the past history, in the Netherlands, for example, we have these sayings that if you don't work, you're not contributing, or
Yeah.
there's a lot of things you have to, you have to work, but you don't have to, you cannot spend. There's a lot of history in this, and it it goes in your genes. It doesn't.
Mm.
It's in your system. It's very difficult to make yourself free from it. But I like, for example, having my lunch outside and sitting in the sun, just for a moment of quietness, or just drinking my tea and just sit there. And then I also look at, for example, um, I watch a number of YouTube channels, and I sometimes I watch them a lot, but sometimes I just watch some of them. I just saw this woman that I know who does this health experience, and she did the human
Mm.
whatever system thing, and it's very strict. So you have to drink like a glass with the salt, yeah, water with salt, and then you have to sit in the sun for 10 minutes so that the eye, so everything. So it's a very healthy system,
Yeah,
but at the same time, it's so driven that everything is so cut out in minutes
yeah.
and how long, and to make you more effective, that I go like, okay, this, I don't think this was the intention of living a better life, to be more effective, right? To be more efficient.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same if you go within a business. If you go within a business, people will help you, for example, to teach something, not because you want to learn something as a human, but this would be improvement for your job, right? This will
It's all
make,
around optimization.
and I go like, why? Why can't we just help people to improve so they become a better person, and that's it?
Yeah.
Not knowing what to expect from it in the end in a job, but that's
Yeah.
it. So, and I think about this book, um, Everybody Matters.
Mm.
And this guy, the CEO of this company, he started an academy to teach his employees. He takes over companies, but he doesn't lay off people to make it more efficient. He just changes, make people happy again, and just make it for the better. So then he has this academy, and the best running course is about asking questions
Mm.
and listening. And what he learned was that people just became better people because
Mm.
they started listening at home at their partner or at their children and asking better questions. And I think
Yeah.
that's the thing that we should be looking for, to have like a place, a community, a job, workplace, whatever it is, which makes you a better person.
Mm. Yeah. Wouldn't it be nice if life were optimized more for that than, I mean, I think there's also one thing that strikes me, I might get shot down for this, I hope not, is there does seem to be quite a strong, at least in my mind, a strong divide culturally between a lot of the conversations that happen in the US around well-being and the conversations that happen in Europe, bearing in mind that Europe is a very diverse place made up of lots of different countries, cultures, languages, etc. I mean, the US is also quite diverse, but tied by a common language and a lot of the same cultural media and stuff. But one of the things that really strikes me when, especially listening to people like Huberman, is this sense that everything, and Joe Rogan, and I enjoy their conversations. I find them really entertaining and interesting, and I learn stuff. And there's a lot of great, exciting science out there. But there is something in the approach and application of the principles and insights that, for me, somehow leaves me feeling cold and missing the point. And it's this sense that if you do all these specific things in a particular order, if you take these supplements, if you do your ice bath, if you do X, Y, Z, blah, 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 then you'll live really long and you'll feel amazing. And it's kind of this, which I'm not disputing, great. I'm glad they're up for it. But it kind of misses this thing around, and again, I wonder how much this is to do with a more Protestant mindset. I mean, it's not just Protestant, but this productivity mindset, which is, what about the role of pleasure? What about the role of being able to take joy in the body? And it kind of makes me think of this Italian study that was done, I don't know how long ago now, probably over a decade, where there were researchers that were looking at the rates of heart problems, heart disease, cancers, things like this. And they're looking at the populations in Italy, and they found that there was one village that had really healthy data for these sorts of things. So people weren't getting as much cancer or heart disease, and yet they were still drinking the same amount, eating the same amount, smoking the same amount. So all of the factors that should have contributed to higher mortality or disease rates were in play. And they're like, well, what's the difference? Is there something going on? And they came to the conclusion over a period of study that it was people's social fabric. It was the fact that this was a community that was with one another. They had a long history together. There was a social protective factor that came into play. And that's just one way of looking at it from a Western perspective. And so there was a sense that we kind of miss some of the obvious things, which is and the interesting thing about that study was that as younger people ended up leaving the village and the social fabric started to untangle and dissipate, the rates of those diseases rose to match those of the wider population. But so there's an interesting thing from that study, and then also from other people's work around other diseases, like Gabor Mate writes about this quite a lot. The protection that you are potentially gifted when your social ties are strong. And of course, part of the social ties, certainly in Europe, certainly in Spain, is going out and having pinchos or whatever, and that's high fat food, often with several glasses of wine, way late into the evening. No one's fasting or so it's kind of, it's not to cast aspersions on that, but it's just to say there are a plurality of ways in which we can experience well-being. And I think being super strict about these things and constantly optimizing for efficiency, productivity, longevity, there's also a question around why, what for, and are you giving up or gaining? Like, what are you giving up and what are you gaining? And everyone's answer will obviously be different to that, but I am certainly someone who prefers to indulge in some of the pleasures. And I don't know. I think you only get, as far as we know, you only get one life. I don't want to get to the age of 90 if I live that long and think, oh, I wish I'd had a few more late nights with my friends around a fire, or no one misses extra work that they didn't put in. I don't know.
I'm also thinking about the blue zones in the world, right? So there are people in general, there are more centennials in the blue zones than on average. And it's like there's, what is it, 7 zones, I think, or 5, I'm not sure what it was. But it's Greece, there's island in Italy, there's Japan, of course, Florida, because old people move there. But the other ones, that's just has a lot to do with a community. And community, it often was related to religion, because they go to the church, for example, together. It was that people lived longer together, so that more generations lived into one home, so that the elder people would take care of the younger ones. And so, for example, we today here in the Western world are so
atomized.
Yeah, we are dependent on systems, on external parties to help us. For example, when we get sick or when we get older, we don't move along as good as we used to. We need people to help us. And in general, they're not our relatives because they are busy working, making their money to make sure that they have a living.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about what you said in the beginning of this conversation was, you said, so your ambition, you're still ambitious, but it changed. What changed?
I think it was getting plugged back into the art and then to the music, which from a very young age, I was always drawing. It as my first love, and then music came second. And I think when I hit my mid-20s, and because I was a professional musician for many years, I recorded albums with a multi-Grammy award-winning producer in the States. I was getting I was getting conversations with labels, and the music nearly happened and then it didn't, and it was a heartbreaking thing. And I kind of left the art and the music. I also went to Central St Martin's for a while, which is a famous art school in London, and was quite disillusioned with that too. And so I kind of ended up leaving that to one side and went down the route of the book writing and then the psychology. And And I remember thinking, for me at least, how much easier and less frightening somehow, or less vulnerable it was to wield intellect on stage than to open your heart and sing. And so there was always this sense that, or at least in my 20s, when I realized that it was possible to get onto a stage and to synthesize knowledge and to teach people stuff, and that would get paid for, which is, brilliant, and I enjoy it. There was a sense that was somehow more valuable, or that in society that's the thing that is kind of like a tool that you hone, and then it's kind of fun and people like it and you get paid for it, and so you keep going down that route. And when I came to Barcelona and I started this art course as a sabbatical, I've never experienced such joy in my life. It was just such a beautiful, beautiful struggle, and it just kind of plugged my whole being back into this sense of beauty and wholeness. And I thought, fuck, I'd forgotten this. And what would have happened if I hadn't, for instance, gone through the challenges that had led me to come away on sabbatical, if I hadn't had the difficult, turbulent time that led up to that, which was a gift and a blessing looking back. And so it was through the art, and then through a friend of mine, Blanche Ellis, who is an extraordinary artist, an extraordinary musician. She brought me back into connection with music, and not from the perspective of this kind of messed up kind of music business system, which had really been painful to go through, but from a perspective of meeting up with other musicians, singing each other's songs. I don't know, it was just such a completely different experience of that. And suddenly, after years, decades of being on the periphery and feeling like a real outlier, I found a sense of belonging. I never thought I would have that. All of the things that my youngest self would have dreamed of and thought this is never going to be possible for me became possible. And that was just, it cracked my heart open. And so then, now that I've been through this 3.5 years of art, and I'm painting and I'm in connection with beauty every day, and I don't mean beauty as in Instagram bollocks beauty, I'm talking about a sense of heartfelt connection with something that is life-giving and transformative. It's like when you go and see a beautiful sunset, you mentioned that few moments of quiet when the wind is just right in this, surrounded by nature, and you're by yourself and you're in that space of, it's kind of like suspension within and deep connection with life. There's this point of transcendence and embodiment and connection all together. And that's so valuable. And I'd forgotten this. And so now, having experienced that, yes, I'm still giving talks, but now with the kind of turbulence that's being wrought by multipolar issues around the climate crisis and AI and biodiversity loss and carbon and economic precarity, all of these different elements. And also the speaking world has changed. People just want to hear about AI because they're quite reactive, and there's all these trends. It's kind of left me thinking, hang on, there is something that is much more, that's calling my attention much more deeply, which is around a deeper rooting of what does it mean to be alive in this moment. And you mentioned before we started recording, this, what was the way that you framed it? It was about how we bring ourselves to our business when we're feeling like we're living in the winding down of, or dismantling, or I guess fracturing of civilizations as we've known it. What do you do when things are disintegrating? And I think that question is, well, you have to plug into something that sustains you, that enables you to face into the struggle with a sense of longing and love and connection. And I've only just started really realizing that for me is a sense of beauty and transcendence and belonging. And that can be in the most simple of things. And so that's what's orienting me with the work and with the business now. It's how do I create something like that in perhaps unexpected settings like the corporate setting or organizational settings, where a lot of leaders are in fairly unenviable positions where they're quite alone. They have a heartfelt sense of wanting to do something, not quite sure how. With the current social media climate, it can feel risky to speak out. So how do you even begin to create spaces where you have more generative conversations, where you're going to make mistakes, you're going to trample on some toes, but there's a sense that you can broach difficult subjects together? I don't know. So I've been thinking about all of these things. And I get the sense that that's something which you're doing with your podcast, and hence why we're having this conversation now. I feel like I'm doing a lot of rambling. What are your reflections?
Well, I was thinking two things about this. First of all, I saw your transformative inquiry session with Dr. Aaron Balick,
Yeah.
and you request for people to join, to see
Yeah.
who wants to join. Has that to do with this change?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's several projects in the works at the moment. So Aaron and I have been friends for many years now, and we've kind of collaborated on a few different projects. He's always there, I've realized, at the beginning of any new project that I embark on, whether it was the podcast 5 years ago, or social media week, or the launch of my first book, which is actually how we met, or the Flourishing Futures Salon, which is something that's now seeded this kind of Flourishing Futures ecosystem that I'm in the process of creating. And so we kind of realized, after coming to the end of a professional chapter, or what feels like a transition point for both of us, that it would be really interesting to do something together with our combined skills. And so he's got a lot of expertise in depth psychology as a psychotherapist, also as a writer of subjects around how social media and other technologies are shaping interpersonal dynamics, social dynamics. He's also run for many years Still Point Spaces, which is a kind of depth psychology community, which was based in East London. And then, I've got the kind of consultative side, business strategy, persuasive tech, ethics, consumer psychology. And so we thought, well, let's combine and do something that can help people track through these points of life transition in a way that has the depth psychology angle, but also has the kind of behavioral science side of things. So I guess you've given me the perfect segue for a little shout out, but if you're watching to this or you're listening to this,
hold on.
And you want a conversation, reach out.
No, I will give you this. So the question is, for who is it?
For who is it? So, and that's a great question. I think if you feel as though you're going through a life transition of any kind, the kind of which you would be comfortable sharing in conversation with me and Aaron and a wider audience, because the first 6 of these conversations we're going to share openly, so on YouTube and on LinkedIn. So it will be a public conversation. So that's really important. If you feel comfortable talking about a life transition that you're going through now, that you want some kind of unpacking with, that you're curious about, that you want to experience some kind of constructive input to, then this is absolutely for you. And it can be anything. It could be, well, business is going quite well. I've got money coming in, I've got a good client base, but something feels like it's not quite right. What do I do? It can be something as seemingly gentle or, small. I mean, it's not small, but small as that. Or it could be, I've left my house, I've changed my job, I'm divorced. What do I do now? Like, I feel like there's something that needs to be created. So it can be anywhere along that spectrum. So if it resonates with you, just, we would love to have you on the show. I know, come on.
I will join.
Please do.
But I also wanted to give you the opportunity to do this. That was the second point I really wanted to make sure that we talk about today. So that was good.
Thank you.
Check.
Generous of you.
Well, it's very selfish too, right?
It's a reciprocal thing.
I think that I have to go back to what you just said.
We're talking about
I think about the part that you mentioned about the beauty, about connecting again with the beauty, and that makes it I think what I've translated to is that makes a well-being for you. That makes a life well-being. And also it makes it possible to live in the world today with all these difficulties that's going on, so that you can connect back with the beauty of art, music, people, and paintings. And I would add, is what I've also seen in several conversations, but also in updates on LinkedIn and so on for people, is if you do something. So one of the key words I wrote down for this conversation was civil disobedience, right? So, for example, if you join Extinction Rebellion, and go on a strike and sit on in the Netherlands on the street because we have the government who's supporting still oil with tax cuts, right? So that's a lot of money that's been not taken in, and also that they can sell their oil for cheap.
Yeah.
And they have been on strike a couple of times, and the numbers of people is growing. But what you see is when you do these actions, even if they're small, right? Even if you're like not sitting on the street themselves and being getting the chance of being arrested and get a record on your label saying so you've been arrested. You don't if you don't can use it, you can be at what they call at the side and support these people. So because they won't be arresting you, a large chance that they don't. Or for example, this woman who's in I don't remember her name, but she's a lawyer, and she's taking on these companies, for example, and how they do their PR and saying false things in the PR, which are greenwashing.
Yeah.
So doing things to contribute to a future that's different or better. That also helps you, even if it's small. It helps you to, have a feeling of hope and not just being hopeless, right? Or just feeling this terrible. I won't say hopeless, but feeling that it doesn't matter what you do because we will go to shit anyway, right? So that feeling is not what you need in a daily life, because it just makes everything for you and everything around you worse, like a bad place to be. So I love what you just mentioned about you connecting again with beauty in the way that you described it. For me, for example, that is like having like rhythm, like doing my walks and doing exercises. Running is a really good feeling for me. But also I write down, I have stopped doing that, but I wrote down for a long time, like 10 things per day, which I'm grateful for. And it's a weird number, I know. But if you start writing down 10 things every day, in a while you see that it's not big things that really you're grateful for. You have all these small things, like for example, preparing dinner with my wife or eating together, right? So, and when you do it often enough, I've noticed that if I want to continue to work, because there's always work to do, like sending somebody an email or just answering something, doing this, there's always something to do, how you feel. But then I go back, oh no, right. It's my wife probably is now downstairs preparing, and I have my office in the first floor, second floor in America. Confusing. Anyway, so then I think, oh no, what really makes me write down tomorrow what I'm grateful is doing this preparation of dinner again. So I should stop working, go downstairs.
Yeah.
So it's these minor things that really make your life better. And it has to do a lot with other people.
Yeah.
Right. So feeling connected, doing things for other people, helping other people. I think actually that is probably also why I have the podcast. One is because I'm very curious, I want to learn. But second is I want to give these people a platform to help them to bring out their message. Even if I just have an audience of one, it's one more person who listens to their story. And I that's what I like. Rambling.
But there's something about something you're saying about the hope. There was so two things. One is that, and I was talking about this with a wonderful chap called Paul Skinner, who runs MarketingKind, which is for marketers who want to have a positive impact in the world, who don't just want to be selling people stuff they don't need, but actually want to use their skills towards a more flourishing future for people. And one of the things that we were talking about was ways in which to think about the future. And he was asking me if I was optimistic. It depends on the day, but there is something around how, if we look back historically, we're really bad at predicting what the future will look like. There are some things that you can say, yes, okay, back in the 1930s, we knew that the climate was going to become more unstable and inhospitable if we continue with fossil fuels. So there are things that you can point towards and say, okay, yeah, absolutely. If we look at the data, this is a likely this is likely to be an increasing risk and what have you. And yet when it comes to innovation, when it comes to shifts in civil and social order, there aren't always ways of predicting how the future will be. So I think when we're thinking about, and this is a loaded word, but I was listening to a podcast around mythology called Living Myth by Michael Need. It's a wonderful podcast. And he was talking about the root of the word apocalypse, because a lot of us can get sucked into this dystopian narrative of, well, we're all screwed, everything's going to be terrible. What's the point? Let's just be hopeless and have whatever reaction we're going to have to that, whether it's denial or it's hedonism or hyperconsumption, whatever it is. And he was saying that actually apocalypsis was about the ending of something and the beginning of something new. So it's never one or the other, it's always both. And so there's something about how do we face into the ending beginning, to this paradox of one thing completing messily and something else being possible. And that ties into a conversation that I heard on The Way Out Is In, which is this wonderful podcast with Brother Phapu, who was the attendant to Thich Nhat Hanh, this sort of Zen master from Plumbit Village who established it. And on this interview, Joanna Macy, who's this ecological pioneer, said something that really struck me. And I've been sharing this because it's a really powerful image and message. And she said, we don't know if what we are now in the early stages of living through is a collapse or if it's a rebirth. And the chances are it's probably both, but we have no way of knowing really. And she was saying whether we see it as a situation in which we are being called to be the death doulas of life as we know it, and this is the end of our civilization, which I don't believe that to be true. Certainly, I think a lot of suffering is present and coming, but whether we see it as a death period or we see it as a birthing period in which we're kind of invited to be the midwives of something new. I mean, birth is also traumatic. Nonetheless, isn't it extraordinary to be able to show up with our presence and attention and love and skills to be stewards of this time, or to be attentive to it? And I think there's something in the nature of how we show up to this moment, in the work that we do, in the partners that we are, or friends, or family members, or stewards of the living world, or whatever it is. There's something around that which I think is really, really important, because you don't know. And anyone who predicts with absolute certainty is almost inevitably going to be wrong. So there's something around that about showing up as best we can with a loving presence and figuring out what we can offer and making sure that we have the chance to rest as well. Like it's that kind of, yeah.
I'm thinking of two things here. It's I was walking in the Black Forest in Germany.
Oh, beautiful.
And there was this time, well, I'm not sure how it is now, but that was a couple of years ago, and it was the wife and I like to go on a run, like I just mentioned. So I go on a run in a forest in the morning, and I'm always an early riser, and so I go when she's still in bed, and that's how I am. I cannot handle that. I cannot change it anyway. That's just how it's. Handle is not the right word, but I cannot change that. But I was deep into the woods, and there's all these dead trees. So there's pine trees. They're all dead. So that's when you drive there, you can see this the whole mountains with dead trees. So that's really a painful picture. And it has to do with this beetle that's eating behind the bark of the tree, which in the end, and it has to do with the beetle and with the drought. So it's a combination of the two. Yeah. And what they do is they cut down the trees because that gives the beetle less space as soon as possible. They have to take out the trees so that the beetles are gone. But there was a sign in German, but it said, you don't see a dead forest here, you see rebirth. It didn't say that, but it was like just what you mentioned. You just see a new forest starting right here. I go like, oh my God, that is an interesting point of view. I've been looking at just as a dead forest, as a problem, but it's also the start of a new forest, of new opportunities, of new life. Because when these pine trees are gone, new other plants will see the light and have sunlight, enough sunlight to start blossoming and growing. So that was a beautiful reframing of this image that we had looking at this. I saw the sign, and I saw the forest. The other thing also about looking about thinking about how we think the future will look like, that we don't see that. And it was like I'm not sure, it was like 1910 or 1890 somewhere. They talked about the horse manure in the streets of New York. That if we would just keep getting more horses, the manure would be like 3 feet, 4 feet. So there was too much manure that was impossible. And that's something that we laugh about now, because you think that's just stupid. That would never happen. But looking back at the time when they said like coal would in the end also be contributing to the heat, that's also from 1920 or 10 something. Already somebody said that. And the same has been said before from oil, also by oil companies in the past. And now we can look back and say, oh yeah, they were right. But that's just looking back with hindsight. So looking back, then we can say, yes, of course they were right. And we still don't know how to change it. But we have no idea about what the future will look like. We may have an indication for the next couple of years, but like Corona happened, and so many things just changed in an instant, in a couple of months. It was just unbelievable how it impacted our lives. So I think that, and I love the book by The Black Swan about these, instances which we have no clue of happening, and it will just have a great impact on what we do. I want to also make sure that we don't run out of time, our time, but I want to have one more topic that I think you know something about. Is about I'm not sure though, so I'm just asking now.
Go for it.
The modern monetary theory. Do you know that?
Not under that label. Go for it.
Okay.
I'm not an economist.
No, I know, but you had conversation with people on these
about
topics.
Cashless society and alternative forms of economics and things.
Yeah, well, this is about the it has a great relation with the deficit myth. A book by Stephanie Kelton. I wrote it down. So I had a conversation with Aaron Rembrandts just this Monday. Wonderful person who writes great articles on these topics about the monetary system. And the modern monetary theory in general talks about that the way that we look at the government and deficit and money is that we see the government's money like a household book, right? The same as our own household book. So there comes money in, there comes money out. You have maybe a debt which you need to pay off at some point. So, for example, you loan for a house, you know that you have to pay mortgage, but at one point you will need to pay off the mortgage, right? So that's the income, cost, maybe a debt, right? So that's the rule. But it's not the same for government. So, and we saw this during the pandemic, right? So it was suddenly possible to help all these people who didn't have a job, all these companies who couldn't work, with money from the government. Some had to be paid back, but some of it just was a gift. Helicopter money, for example, in the US, but also here in Europe, the same happened. So the system is different for the government. It is not the same, but it makes just a logical story if we think it's the same. So if we would look at taxes completely differently, that you tax the people who make too much money compared to what we need, and for the rest, we make sure that we give people enough money to live. And not just money, just giving like cash, but also like making sure that there's education available at a good price. We have public transportation. We have taking care of kids if you need to work, right? Childcare.
Yeah.
Health is taken care of. That you if you go to a hospital, you don't have like huge monies to need to pay. No, everything is taken care of. And another thing is, we kind of like today need like a job. We need work to feel whole, right? even if it's like 24 hours a week, we feel that we need to contribute to something. And also, we could do that if we do it in a way that, for example, we don't do it in a private system, but we do it in a public system. So, for example, if somebody doesn't have a job, you can give them a job as from a public standpoint of view, just, for example, taking care of elderly, or just cleaning the street, or anything that just makes the world work, to makes it to makes it complete. And Evan gave me this thought, and I start reading about it. I'm just started the book for the deficit myth, and I think it's a crazy idea, but it could work, right? So instead of just having these companies who just make more money, and finding tax loopholes,
yeah,
in the world, and not paying money to the government, and while they're still using all these resources and things, they use the education, people that work there, they use the roads to get their stuff to the people.
All these resources.
Everything. They use everything from, the public, and then extract the money to the private system for them as a owner or as shareholders, just for the few. So the fewer will just get richer today in the capitalist system, and most of people will just stay poor, right? And we can see that there's still 850 million people in the world who are living below what we call, the state that we need is to have enough money, and that's $1.50 a day, which is nowhere near enough.
Yeah.
Still a lot of people living in hunger. So we have enough money, we have enough resources, we just haven't
distributed them properly.
Yes. So I think this could be but you haven't learned about it. So this gave me a chance to tell you something about it. I'm not an expert in it, but I think this was a great theory that I want to dive deeper into, and hopefully to get some guests in the podcast to talk about this idea. So
there's also someone interesting that you could reach out to, Brett Scott. I interviewed him about his book, Cloud Money, talking about cashless society. And he has a background in economics, but he also teaches about alternative systems, or talks about alternative systems. And I interviewed him for the Advaya Seeking Freedom in a Digital Age course that I curated with them. He'd be brilliant to bring onto the show about that, because he talks in interesting ways about finance and what's happening in that world.
And thank you, but I have also a but on this, because what I'm trying to do since a couple of weeks is just to focus on female experts.
Oh, interesting. I think if I think of any, Della Duncan, you could reach out to her, because she's brilliant and she's a renegade economist. She'd be fantastic on the show, and you could check out some of her guests, because she interviews lots of really interesting people. But Della Duncan would be great.
And I can tell you why I'm focused on female women is because I think men have had privileges for long enough, and I think if I just focus more and be just really aware of this, and just deliberate choices on women experts, I will just see more of them. I will just see more experts. I will just get more experts.
I love that.
And other people will also listen to other women experts, female experts.
You're hacking confirmation bias for the greater good.
Hopefully. I'm doing a bit of I'm trying to do a bit of it. So
that's wonderful. Yeah.
So any other thing that you want to mention, that you want to say?
Well, in terms of conversations such as these, the new season of my podcast, formerly known as the Hive Podcast, but we haven't done the transition yet, because it's been 5 years this year, and I want to do something which is a bit easier to search, will be coming out in autumn. And it's likely to be called, just very simply, In Conversation with Nathalie Nahai, because the Hive, since I sort of started it 5 years ago, there's lots of podcasts called the Hive, so clearly the name needs to change. And then watch this space. I'll be launching the Flourishing Futures Salon website in the next few months as well. And if you're listening to this and you want to find out more about how we can have conversations that enable the possibility for generative solutions, deeper questions, especially within organizations, corporate. So how can we step into leadership that enables us to connect with a deeper set of values. That's something that I'll be launching fairly soon. So watch this space. And if you want to check out my art, which you're welcome to, I'm on Instagram at Nathalie Nahai. So
Yeah, yeah, of course. I'll make sure that the link's in there. So, Flourishing Future Salons,
yeah.
and that's I guess is like a reference to the salons that in the past from Paris, and so on.
Yeah, so Paris, Italy, these kind of hubs for cultural and political change in which people would come together. And often they were run by women. And it was one of the few domains in which women, prior to being able to vote, had influence and power and were able to constellate interesting minds. And it gave birth to all kinds of movements. Yeah, so I'm kind of giving a nod and a wink to all the
I think it's more than
that came before.
Yeah. But also, I'm interested. So, is this going to be online or is it going to be physical?
Well, I mean, I suppose it could be online, but I'm very interested in physical, embodied, around a dinner table kind of experiences. Wow. And then when it comes to putting it into a more corporate or organizational domain, panels which are highly facilitated, no tech, no titles, you're not allowed to status swing. And it's addressing a core question around how do we conceive of and create flourishing futures for all. So that's kind of the premise. And it will be through 4 lenses. So the lens of technology, nature, society, and the arts. And it's modeled off of a couple of small personal Flourishing Future salon dinners that I've run in London and I'm starting to run in Barcelona. So yeah, watch this space.
I'm looking forward to that. Oh my gosh. I think I can copy maybe some of that and see how
we could do it together in the Netherlands. I mean, I am looking for collaborators.
Oh gosh.
Co-hosts. Yeah, yes. So if you want to do one in the Netherlands, let's have a chat about it.
It sounds so interesting. Well,
I think there's a lot of synergy there.
First of all, of course, I'm going to join the thing with Dr. Aaron Balick, Transformative Inquiry Sessions. I'm going to join that to make sure you see my inquiry coming in.
Can't wait.
And I really, again, enjoyed this conversation. I think it was informative. I learned from you, and hopefully you learned from me.
Likewise,
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what this is all about. Yeah, like the salons. I think. Last thing I want to add here is this. What I've learned from a colleague was she went to sessions. Oh no, I forgot her name, and she talks about warm data, and it is about knowledge. Doesn't come from capturing and reading books on your own. It comes from conversations with other people. So you can think about having knowledge and then like a cloud above your head, but not a lot happens there. When you have 2 people, when there's a cloud in the middle, because of the discussions you have, that's where knowledge really happens and bursts and gives you ideas. So I think what this is all about, having these conversations and just creating new knowledge and new ideas. So thank you again for this, Nathalie.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's lovely to be back with you. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of your conversations going forward.